Hi Whiskers! Welcome to the penultimate book in the Dark Tower series, The Song of Susannah. This book really indulges in that intertextuality. Everything exists, but everything is not quite real. And finally these false spectres step into the real world and everything they do matters all of a sudden in ways that it didn't matter before, that it didn't feel real before, that wasn't real before. And it's really complicated, but it's also really well explained. Um, I, I cannot fathom how this book makes sense, honestly. And that's a testament to true skill. Everything seems crystal clear. Everything is almost obvious, and it's not. So that's really a testament to good, concise writing that any of this makes sense at all. Okay, so sugar has to be the intertextuality. This book gives me worlds upon worlds, and it's clashing, and there's breaking, and it's bending, and magic, and it all makes sense. There's time travel we've had for a while, multiple worlds we've had for a while, but now the interconnectedness of stuff, it all makes sense. All of these worlds make sense. And you can sort of predict what's going to happen. They've almost turned parallel universes into a hard magic system that makes sense. No butterfly effect of maybe something will happen. You can kind of sort of reliably tell what's going to happen when the worlds affect each other, and it's amazing. And I will get right at the end to the most amazing part of this intertextuality because it's a spoiler. And then the vinegar has to be the aesthetic or design choices that were made. And it's sort of difficult to explain. A description paints a picture with words. And I guess the paintings just weren't quite my style. I really think they could have been cooler. They could have been better. They could have been more interesting. So it wasn't a major letdown, but it was a little bit of a disappointment. The design or aesthetic choices made. But I will get into it later. For now, would I recommend this book? Honestly, if you've gotten this far into the series, just keep going. It just gets better from here. This is, I don't know if it's my favorite book so far, but it's 5 stars, so it's right on par with The Drawing of the Three, which was my favorite so far. So I don't know, but it's great, and I say 100% go for it. If you've been enjoying the series so far, nothing is stopping you. So, what do I mean with this aesthetics thing? So I'm going to throw up, as I'm speaking, photos or paintings of ships, art of ships. And then you'll see that every one of them has a different style, a different perspective, a little bit of a different mood, a different way of framing the ship. Some of them, it's very clearly just a ship in the daylight, and some of them it's moody and nighttime and implies magic or fantasy or sci-fi or something to it. So that's what I mean by aesthetics. And the paintings that Stephen King chose to use here, or the framing of the aesthetic that he chose to use here, I found disappointing. Okay, so all of this talk about aesthetics is purely personal. So feel free to skip it, as if the rest of this review will not be entirely subjective. So feel free to skip it if you want, but I'm going to talk about it for a while. So in terms of the real world, the realist world, that this magical place with clashing worlds and giant turtles and monster bears and gunslingers and magic and wolves and everything, the realist world we have is New York of 19 something. It's the most boring, simple answer. And I can't fault it too hard because I think it might be that simplicity that allows the text to be so clear. because you don't need to world build New York 19 something. It exists. Everybody's sort of like, I've never been there, but because of all the other cultural influences, I sort of have an idea of what it's like. I sort of have an idea of what characters could exist there, what is possible in this world. Gravity works just like it does here. You know, there's a lot of assumptions that you can just kind of not explain, which keeps the exposition at a minimum. So I guess that's the one that I have the least amount of issue with. I take the least issue with. The others, I don't understand why you just couldn't have some more fun with it. So the first of those is Susannah's inner world. So when she steps into her own mind in the back end and configures it, what she does is, it's sort of like this pseudo military security panel. So you have like switches and dials and a lot of screens showing you different perspectives of her mind. Almost like Nick Fury's panel of screens and dials and buttons and things that do things. I guess it's a little bit like a cockpit almost. I guess that's probably as good as any. I understood it when I read it, but I don't think he especially gave it a name. But I just thought that was boring. I had expected that the Lady of Shadows have a shadowy realm in her mind and a more interesting way of interacting with herself like that. Like, we have the Lady of Shadows and she is multiple people, but I'd like to see more play on the symbolism of shadows. Or, alternatively, wasn't Odette, the original Susannah, wasn't she and her father, like, weren't they really into trains? And wasn't she like fascinated with trains as a child, and her father always took her on trains? Why isn't like it's sort of a locomotive console with the big thing that you pull, and to give something fuel she has to throw things into the furnace? Like, that could have been interesting. I just wish it had been character oriented, you know, because it feels way too modern. Susannah is a woman who grew up in the 1950s with trains, and you know, it doesn't fit, and I just don't like it. The other one is the design of the monsters, the main enemy. We meet them at the very end of the book, and they're like the vampires and the low people and those guys. It's their highest level guys, the big bad boss form. And it's like animals who are wearing human skin that's peeling off in all types of grotesque ways. And it's fine. I didn't really find it as horrific as I think I should have. The thing is just, I'm wondering where the symbolism is here. It doesn't link to anything else we've ever heard. Isn't really culturally very powerful. Like animal heads on human bodies, sort of Egyptian mythology. Like, what does this, why? I want it to work together with something, for it to link into character or world or something from Roland's past, or have them be the mutants from Roland's world, or something we've had before, because this just feels out of nowhere. Monsters with human faces peeling off, and it's not as scary as it sounds. It's not described like in a way that I found horrific or upsetting. It was just like, oh, so that's it. I was disappointed by their design. And then Mia. So this one is probably the least obvious that Stephen King chose the boring route of designing this character. We meet Mia's true form. So she is a spectral spirit who used to seduce men, and then she found out she really wanted to be a mama, and now her whole thing is motherhood, and she's like heavily pregnant and stuff. She's just a pretty lady. Is that really the most interesting way you can portray a spirit who is obsessed to a maleficent degree with motherhood? Is that really like motherhood taken too far, as just a pretty pregnant lady who's still skinny? And like, you could have pushed that idea much further. What would a spirit obsessed with motherhood look like? If she could determine her form herself, because it's essentially something happening in their minds, why does she not see herself as fuller, more generous, more all of those sort of social ideas of motherhood, of being able to care for and feed, and there's just a lot missing there. And I think it's the obvious choice. It's the boring choice. Make Mia beautiful. Yeah. Because, see, it really works. It functions. I can't really be mad at the lack of imagination or symbolism or meaning behind these designs, because in the end, they function. This clusterfuck of events makes sense. I guess that's the most important bit, right? So let's get into the plot. Okay, so the plot is sort of divided into 3 parts. The first part is Susannah and Odetta and Mia sort of vying for control inside of a body and navigating New York together. And then, yeah, so they're sort of on their journey trying to find the people who are supposed to help them give birth, because she is in labor during all of this and has to exercise a lot of control over herself and her multiple selves. And it's sort of involved, but the actions they take are pretty simple. And we also find out that the whole point of the baby is to kill Roland because the Dark Tower has to fall. Why does the Dark Tower have to fall and world as we know it to end? Evildoers doing vague evil things. I don't know if we have a reason yet. I think the mystery is being set up, but there's sort of not room for it to be well developed. There's too much going on already for us to really get into why villain. It's good enough that there is a villain, and even if there weren't, like, sometimes things just fall apart. Disaster strikes. But there's definitely like this type of conspiracy of people acting to encourage the downfall of the world. Then we have Jake and Per Callahan, and they're sort of looking for Susannah, trying to find a place to hide Black 13 and And then Eddie and Roland are at first trying to stay... and then Eddie and Roland. At first, they're trying to save Towe, the bookkeeper guy, from Eddie's gang, who have resurrected in this different timeline. Resurrected, they just existed in the different timeline and never died in this timeline. So they arrive and we fight them, and it's actually a really good fight scene. I could actually tell what was going on 90% of the time. So it was the best fight scene so far, although it wasn't the most interesting, it was the most clear so far. And then they sort of start figuring out the world. They get us all the exposition, and it doesn't feel like exposition. It really does, because you're so interested in it. You really are keen on discovering this mystery with them. And they also meet Stephen King. I'm going to get into him at the end of the characters, because the addition of Stephen King was a stroke of bloody genius, and it is the intertextuality that is my favorite part of this book. So, okay, characters first. So, characters. I'm only going to handle 2 characters because really there wasn't a lot of development going on. There was too much other stuff happening. So I'm just going to focus on Susannah and then Stephen King, because that was really trippy. And yeah. Okay, so first, Susannah. I'm confused about Susannah. So I thought Lady of Shadows. We meet her as Odette. Odette Holmes? Odetta Holmes. Yeah, we meet her as Odetta Holmes. And then we meet her shadow self, which is Deda Walker, right? And then they merge, Roland merges them, and then they become Susannah Dean, married to Eddie Dean, right? But now Susannah is in her own head as Susannah Dean. But then Detta Walker also exists inside of her, in her head. So did these two characters merge or did they not? Because maybe I missed something, but I thought it was just kind of bad characterization that the Detta Walker part of Susannah was so understated and sort of non-existent. But maybe the merge just didn't quite happen the way I thought it had. I don't know. So that's confusing. The characters split again at some point. I no. And then we also have Mia and them vying for control over and over again. It's sort of difficult to talk about Susannah because I've given up on her as a character. We've spent so much time ignoring her, not caring about what she's thinking and feeling. It just she feels very much like a MacGuffin or a prop at this point. And she does some things, she has some agency in this book, although most of the things that she does is in her head. And the thing is, ultimately, she just prolongs. Okay. And ultimately, she doesn't do anything except delay the inevitable for a little bit. And I'm very happy we get to spend a little more time with her. But then she just ends up as a damsel in distress again. And it was interesting being with her. And I appreciated that we actually got to get her point of view a little bit. But it's sort of clear which characters are well written and well rounded and well understood, and which characters are sort of not. And I definitely felt that about them, and just can't help it. I don't like. She's the one I'm gonna care least about when she dies because she is essentially a MacGuffin. She's the baby carrier, the baby that's going to kill Roland carrier. And other than that, I don't know anything about how she thinks and feels about these things. It's sort of generic. So, yeah. Maybe that's just me. Maybe I'll feel differently going on. I'm definitely glad we got more from her. But it wasn't enough to save her as a character for me. Okay, so Stephen King. Dean and okay, so they're all now in the really, really real world that actually exists, and all the other worlds are spinning off of this world. So essentially, if anyone writes a book, that book creates an alternative universe that spins off from the main universe. And Stephen King is a character who exists in this really real world, and we meet him, and it's sort of jarring and weird and really trippy. So let me explain, because that sounds bad, but it isn't bad. It's good, but it's disturbing. So he exists in this world as a writer. He exists as Stephen King from the past. I know it's from the past because I read his memoir on writing. And you recognize the stage of life he's talking about. And then Roland and Eddie meet him. They have a short interaction, which is basically learning more about this world and the mystery. And apparently Stephen King is pivotal to the survival of the Dark Tower. And then at the very end, we get diary entries from Stephen King. And it sort of goes on long enough that I felt like I was reading the memoir again. And I was into it and I was like, okay, let's... And then he dies. Stephen King dies. And in a newspaper article. And I was like, no, this is not right. Stephen King has to finish the Dark Tower series first. The Dark Tower series is written and Stephen King is still alive. And it was so true, so real, that I was legit ripped out of the story. And it was jarring, and I had to kind of come to terms with the fact that the book that I was reading was fiction. And it felt wrong that it was fiction. It felt I was confused. it legit took me a couple of moments to process, wait, Stephen King died in the story, not in the real world. Because if all these worlds exist and are spin-offs of the other worlds, then, and the story we're reading exists in a different plane, then it just, I don't know how to explain it, but it almost felt like the Stephen King in the book and the Stephen King of our world was the same person. Like we were reading a memoir like we were reading a memoir or a biography, and I was just I didn't understand. I sort of can't understand the feeling even now, because it really did take me a while to just what? Huh? And I think that is intertextuality. Mixing enough of real world and stories and making it so natural that this, like, the stories that we know exist, and it made it so natural to believe that if they say this is the really real world, then this has to be the really real world. And previously we were just living in a book, but in this book, in the last book, we finally step into the really real world. And then to find out that this world, the one we've just stepped into, is also not true, is also not the one I exist in. It's really weird. It's really, really weird. Okay, Whiskers. So I can't say weird again, but this book was trippy and I loved it. Once again, 5 stars. And I'd really love to hear what you guys thought. If you've ever read it, did you also have to reorient yourself in reality for a moment? And if you haven't read it, has any other book ever done this before? Because it was the strangest experience I've ever had. I've never been on the drugs and things, so maybe that's what that's like. I just, nah. So please let me know what you thought. And if you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. I'd love to grow our community a little bit bigger. And join the Discord, guys. Ta-ta!